All right, everybody, and good morning. So today we're going to be talking about cinematic lighting and the idea behind what we're trying to do with that. Basically, what we have is we have our object that we're modeling, and we want to basically take a picture of it. Just think of it like a marketing ad or something like that, where there is going to be a simple backdrop that we can use that creates an infinite kind of background that doesn't really create edges or anything like that. There's multiple ways to do it, and we're going to be basically focusing on what's called I'm calling it a 4-point lighting, but it's really a 3-point lighting. I have to use 4 in the digital world, but it's the 3-point lighting setup. Which the idea of this is that it's going to give you the ability to create an illumination for your object in your scene based on the camera location, and then some what's called a key light and a fill light and a directional light that creates a nice backlight on the object. Now our objects are going to be on a neutral background. It's basically a light color. So these rim lights, these backlights aren't going to make as much difference right now, but they will in the future. So we've got what's called a key light, a fill light, and what we call these kicker lights or rim lights in the back. So the idea is we want to be able to, so here's an example of this in the real world. Well, they have this bent piece of material. You see this all the time when you have your photo taken and the photo, go to a photo shop and they take your family picture or whatever, and they pull down a background, and usually you stand, they pull it down as a big sheet like a big blind, and then you stand on it. It creates this seamless kind of surface. So this has a bend to it right here, and then you have this infinite kind of background. Then what you can do is you'll have your object sitting on there. It captures the shadows nicely, but it doesn't really cause you any distraction in the back. There's no need for anything back there. And so the backing lights or the rim lights actually create this really beautiful kind of edge to your object. So you see this a lot in interviews when you go and you watch a news interview, Oprah or Barbara Walters. They'll have this nice environment, but then they'll have some sort of backlight that kind of gives the person a hair, the hair kind of glows a little bit. I just saw this just recently. But you get this kind of nice illumination across the back. But what you want is to be able to light the object from one side and then balance that out from the other side. And then we'll look at some little tips that can help create some control over what your lights shine on. Here's a nice example of a key light creating this nice higher contrast. Then you have a fill light coming in and filling in this side. So if all we ever had was this key light, all this would be in shadow over here if it wasn't bouncing off walls and that sort of stuff. So we don't. And then the background is just usually a paint, backdrop or something like that we aren't particularly worried about it. But then you can see here on the back edge, they've got this light from maybe a window or something else. They're simulating that. So you get this nice kind of rim light around this back edge of the character. And so that's really what we're going to be trying to set up. 3 basic points where the light will be coming from. What's called a key light, a fill light, and then we call the rim light. And I usually use 2 directional lights because I can't get quite enough spread on the light from the back. But you can experiment with this. So the idea is we want to fill the object. We want to fill out the object so that we can see its details and get a sense of it being sitting on the ground with its nice, it's not floating in space, but it's sitting on the surface with some nice shadows. So we'll pay attention to our shadows. And right now with what we're doing, we are just using basic lights, basic we're not really using colors. We're still in the contrast. We'll get into colors at the very end. All right, so we haven't really worked with colors yet. We're using our object And our object is still in the grayscale, if you will, or where we apply a material to it, and we've defined the edges, or the objects and what material would be on it, just like we did earlier in our first project, where we have, this is either shiny or it isn't shiny, it's dark or it's light. We're still doing that with this. And then after this, once we get through the critique on Wednesday, then we will look at adding texture maps, which will define the surface quality, what type of surface it really is. Is it painted? Is it brick? Does it have bumps? Does it have texture? All of that sort of stuff. Is it painted? Does it have labels and stickers and paint and all of that sort of stuff? That's going to be the final step. So our object will then have all of that added to it. But for now, we are going to have some of the details of our object won't be there because we might be relying on a texture map to create some surface features. The really small bumps and that sort of stuff that we aren't going to be modeling. So our object is basically going to have the larger types of creases and typical large molded in or formed basically the bumps and stuff that you would see that's fairly large that we would model. Does that make sense? So what I'm going to do first is we're just going to go through a basic setup with just generic geometry that we'll start with, so we can just get the idea of what we're looking for. And then what you want to do is you're going to take that and bring your go to your scene with your object. So you should be at a point now where you have enough geometry that we can actually look at something and start lighting it and photographing it. You have something to show. Last week we worked on our models. Now you should have something that we can actually look at, sit it on the ground, put a plane underneath it to catch the shadows, and then build our lights around it so that we can start to see its features and see what it looks like. Does that make sense? So that's where we should be today, because we want to be able to light that. And now we want to spend most of our time getting the lighting right, not modeling and trying to get all that done. Because like you have learned so far, once you add lights and you start working on it, that can take a lot of time to get it right. It isn't always just I throw them in place and magically everything looks good. It doesn't work like that. It takes a lot of time to get the lights in position, figure out your composition, and moving things around and re-rendering takes a lot of time. So if you're still trying to do that and model and everything else, it's going to take a great deal of time. So get your model modeled, get it finished to the point where you're going to be satisfied with it, and then work on your lighting. But today I'm assuming you have your model to the point where we can throw lights on it. And from what I saw last week, most of you do have your models in a point where you can do it. Does that make sense? So I'm going to walk you through the process of how we do this, basically. We're not going to be using Arnold for this. We're going to use our basic Maya materials and keep things very, very, very simple. So go ahead and bring up a Maya scene. And for now, we can go ahead and create a project called Cinematic Lighting. Save it to your desktop. So one other thing that's really important is you want to light to your camera angle, to your composition, right? We are building lights around our scene from the point of view of the camera. If you build your lights and constantly move your camera, then your lights are going to be all screwed up. Think of it like an actor on stage who has to hit his mark, because that's where the cameras and lights and everything are set for him to stand, right? So this object is going to be in place, and you're going to have a camera ready to look at it and in the right position, and then you're going to build the lights to make at that point. Don't do all this. Don't constantly change things. Decide what you're going to do and then alight that. And then Otherwise, you'll never stop. It never ends because everything is constantly changing, and you're adjusting this and adjusting that. So decide where your camera is going to be and build your object around it. And every object is going to be different, right? Your object isn't going to be like my object, and the composition that I create is going to be based on the attributes of my object, how I see it, how am I looking at it, and is it clear? Is it clear in the, like these shoes? It's clear. They're not overlapping. If you look at those shoes on the wall, they're not overlapping. The shoestrings lead your eye. So there's a composition there, right? It's not blocking itself. It doesn't have weird shadows that are kind of obnoxious or anything like that. So we really are still thinking about composition all the time. And putting things in our scene. Excuse me. So all I'm going to do right now is I'm going to be working, and one of the things you want to do is you want to try to work as efficiently as you can. Sometimes I'm not the best example of efficiency, but I try, when I think about it, to be a good example. So one of the things that you can do when we're working in Maya is set up your scene to help you organize all these stinking panels that pop up. There's panels for this and panels for that and windows for this, and this pops over. One of the things that when you kind of get used to these different setups, you can start to split your screen to be a little more efficient. So what I want to do in my workspace is to say, look, I want a window for my shot cam, the one that I'm taking my picture from, a perspective view so I can fly around my scene and actually look at everything and not be confused, and then a render view scene that's going to just sit there and I can render from, okay? And then I can move in and out of these. One of the ways you do that is that you can go up to your panels, and I'll just demonstrate this for a second. Panels, then we have these different layouts, all right? There's saved layouts that are already, and then there's just layouts as windows. What I use a lot is the 3 panes split bottom. What that's going to do is it's going to give me windows on the bottom, 2 on the bottom, 1 on the top. Then I can choose what I want to go in here. I can say panel, render view, and then I have my render view up here. And if I render a scene, I can have that popped up. And then I can choose over here my shot cam, which I haven't made yet. And then I can choose my perspective cam over here so that this is perspective view. And then I can move around my scene and work from this view. I can see it over here in my workspace where the cameras line up, and then what it's going to look like rendered up here. That is a helpful setup. You could use the same setup for lots of other things. You can put in whatever panel you want in any of these panels. Does that make sense? If you want to go back to any other perspective view or anything like that, you can use your saved layouts, and you can say 4 panes and go back to it simply by doing that. Does that make sense? So that's something I do a lot. Set up my scene, set up my all this sort of stuff. I can also bring up different panels by bringing up different things that I might want by just bringing them up, and the UI and all that sort of stuff. So sometimes I'll bring things up that way, but typically, oh great, it's going to get stuck. Typically, I will keep my area clean. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to create a simple plane. I'm going to go back to my 3-pane view. So it's under layouts, 3 panes, split bottom. I'm going to go into my perspective view, and I'm just going to make a simple plane for my object to sit on. So this is going to be my ground plane, and I'm going to label it as such. And I'm going to be working out of this basic space. I'm not going to scale things up to be super huge in this environment. I'm going to just kind of work, and I might have to make this plane a little bit bigger later on. But I'm going to name this plane my ground plane. So GRND, PLN, or something like that. Something so I know what it is. So I have a ground plane here. And I might just get rid of this grid so it's not as annoying as it can be sometimes. So here's where my world is going to be, and then I'm going to create an object. I'm just going to create a sphere for now. Just a simple sphere. And what I want to do is I want to make sure my object is sitting on the ground and just slightly breaking through. So watch, I don't want it floating above the ground like this, or there's this gap. And I don't want it to be sinking in the ground either. I want to raise it up to the point where I can basically see it from underneath breaking through. And when I get close, sometimes it's hard to get it just right. And what's nice is if I hold down Alt and push the up arrow, I can incrementally raise it and lower it by little steps if I want. So sometimes that's nice to nudge it around just to give it small. And I can nudge it to the right and I can nudge it to the left by just holding down Alt and moving those around. So that's a nice way to kind of make sure that it's touching the surface. Does that make sense? That way when we get shadows, it doesn't look like it's floating. That's one thing you want to watch for, is your object floating above the ground, because we're going to point that out. So don't make that obvious. Don't make it obvious that it's floating. Unless it's supposed to be floating, but right now everything's real and sitting on the ground. So I'm going to make this plane a little bit wider and a little bit. And I'm just going to use a flat plane for now. I have made a diorama where I bend it, and I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to do something a little different. So here's my object on my scene. Now what I want to do is I want to create my camera for what I'm going to be looking through. So I'm going to go back to my orthographic view over here, and this is where I'm going to say panel, perspective, and I'm going to say I want a new perspective camera. And this is going to be what's called my shot cam or my main cam, or you can name it whatever you want. I always just kind of say it's shot cam, and then I could give it a number 1 or 2 or something like that. But this is, you can name it whatever. You can say it main camera, shot cam, front cam, side cam, whatever. And so if I'm in my scene here and I can see that camera floating over here in space, and this is what it looks like. So here it is. I can fly around in that, and I'm going to look basically. The front of this object is going to be looking down the z-axis, so I'm going to orient it that way. It doesn't necessarily have to be pointing down it, because every object is going to have a unique, a unique shape. I'm going to bring this up. And so basically this is a shot, and I'm going to have to decide where I want it to be for now. Now what I want to do is, once I get my camera created, I've got to make sure I have my render settings and everything set up, so I'm looking through my camera viewport and I can actually see what the camera is going to take a picture of, right? So I'm going to turn off this grid a little bit. So I have to go to my project settings, like we've done before. And I need to set up the type of resolution that I'm going to be using. So my image size, we're just using the full 1024. And again, that's 1,024 pixels in width and 768 pixels in height. And right now, since I'm kind of working with this, and if I want to save some time, I will not be at production quality. I could be at preview or intermediate. Just remember that you have to change that later. And this is really just for speed of just rendering. So it's a pretty low quality image. And I'm not turning on anything that's going to take any more time right now. I'm going to be just working to get lighting balanced. So anything that's going to take up a lot of time, like ray tracing, I'm not going to have on. So I'm not going to turn any of that stuff on yet. So I basically have my preview quality set, and I have my image size. I'm going to say OK. And then I'm going to go up and turn on my resolution mat here. And so what this is going to say is it's going to say 1024 by 768. So this is the size, but it's kind of not fitting in my window. What I want is more like a rectangle here. So all of our cameras have different settings on them. And the camera settings can be accessed by looking through the camera you want, say View, camera settings, and one of the things that I need to do, I'm going to go to down here and say vertical. So it's going to give me, it's going to put this in here so I have space in my vertical side so I can bring that in. So it was under view, camera settings, and vertical. These different ones can change it. So if I change those, it might look different. What I always typically do is I want it to look like this. Everything that's grayed out is not in my camera view, and everything that's out in this spot here is what the camera is going to see. So this is like looking through the eye of the camera. Does that make sense? All right. So I can gray that out if I want, or I can leave it clear and just have the bold line. So that's up to you, whatever you might want to do. I typically have it grayed out. So now I want to set my camera into the scene where I think I want to take a picture of this thing. And this is going to depend on your object. And this is just to get the basics, the basic lighting setup. Now this is without any lights at all. And I need to render from my particular, let's see if this happens to you when you think you're going to, see the image here. If I went up, what I did is I went up and I pressed render, or I did something, and it didn't render from that particular camera. So if that confuses you, you weren't prepared for it, one of the things you can do is in your render view is choose which camera to render from, because now we have a new one, shot cam. If I click perspective cam, it's going to render from there. If I choose render shot cam, it's going to render from here. Does that make sense? So right now I have a basic object on a plane. Now one of the things that we can do with the magic of the computer and different types of materials, I'm going to go ahead and place a material on my object. And I'm just going to put a simple assign new material, just like we've done in the past, a Maya surface, Maya material, and just a blend, just to give it a little bit of something. And on the ground, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're not going to apply a blend or anything else like that. We're going to create a different type of material. And what it's going to do is it's going to act as basically a shadow catcher that's going to catch the shadow, but it's going to basically be the color of the background. So in a moment, I'll show you that. Right now, when we render this, notice that this is gray and the background is gray. And we actually have some clear distinction between the background color and the objects that we're rendering, which are color values, RGBs. So right now, this is transparent basically, and this is the solid area where we'll see an image. We're going to be taking this object, the ground plane, and we're going to be assigning a different type of material to it. So when we go here and we right click on that object, we go down to assign a new material. When we go to our Maya surfaces, if I click on Maya or Maya surface, we can go here and see there's one called use background. So all the ones, the only thing that we've been using thus far is blend and some Phong, Lambert, and isotropic. But now we're introducing this use a background. So what this is going to do is it's going to basically look transparent, and it's going to use the background color of our camera. And so our camera here, when I look at this scene, if I was to render it again, notice that it looks all black. And what we're going to notice is that it's basically still there, but what we'll see is in a minute, when we start adding lights and shadows, that it's going to start capturing those shadows, but make a nice seamless backdrop. So black right now is pretty harsh. It's pretty devoid of color. And what we can do is on our camera, I can select my camera by clicking on this little icon here, and just like or saying view select camera, And every camera that we have is going to have attributes. And just like we have with materials, we have these little tabs that that twirl down that we can use. And one of the things that we want to look at gives us the ability to change that environment background that's going to show up in the areas, basically in the void space, the infinite void of space. And so we have environment. I'm going to twirl this down, and it gives me the ability to change the color. And if I click on that or slide this little slider, I have white to black. And if I wanted to, I could click on a various hue here and choose a color, and that could become the color of the background. So if we make it white, for instance, if I make it white when I render from this camera, the background is white, and so is the ground. If I choose select camera and I change the background to some other color, like this one, and I render, that background is here. Does that make sense? So the object, we're instead of making like a curved diorama that we're lighting and all that, we can basically just have a ground plane that will capture a shadow. So that can make it a little bit easier for us to do this, okay? So right now we're just running default. I have my object sitting on the plane, even though you can't see it. So there's my plane and there's my object. It's no longer sitting there. And does that make sense so far? So change the color to a gray. And so I'm going to do I'm going to do kind of a dark gray so that you can see the rim lighting and everything like that. So for our object, we're going to do a darker, just a slightly dark gray so that we can see the key light, the fill light, and the rim light. When it's white, you can't see the rim light in the back. Okay, so I want something to contrast. And so let's go ahead and change that. So it looks something like this, maybe slightly a little bit darker, and well, you can adjust that as we go. Okay? Basically, did it work? So, did you make sure you're rendering from the right camera? Make sure you're rendering from the right camera. Make sure you're rendering from the main camera. It will not work on any. So if I rendered from the perspective view camera, it will not show up because that camera's background is black. So every camera has its own attributes. So make sure your shot cam or whatever it is, that's the background that you're choosing. So I'm selecting my camera by either choosing this little icon here or go up to view and say select camera and then my background. Does that make sense? Everybody got that? All right. So I have my camera set in my scene. I'm making sure I'm rendering from that scene. And here we go. So what I want to do is, right now it's rendering out from the default lighting. Let's go ahead and I'm just going to turn on the shading here so that I have wireframe on so I can see it. So again, my shot cam, let's go ahead and put in a bookmark for our shot cam. Let's say that this is our shot. And what I want to do is I want to say view in my bookmark. And I want to go to edit bookmark. And this is where I just want to type in a name and say shot 1. Shot, and I have to spell it out. Shot 1. So we could call it something more descriptive, front right, front left, top high, 45 degrees, whatever you want to call it, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, whatever it is that's going to tell you what that shot is. Because typically I might try other views, and I'm just going to say shot 1, close. And what that does is if I move my camera and I get to it, and by mistake or on purpose, a lot of times I'll move the wrong one. I can just go to my bookmark, say shot 1, and it'll put it right back. What I do a lot of times is I'll be in the wrong frame, and I'll be like thinking I'm over here, and I'm over here, and then I'll move it, and it could, once that little move happens, then your render is screwed up. So if you go back to your bookmark, puts it back where it was, and you could lock that if you wanted to. Does that make sense? So here we are in this scene, and what I want to do now is just start adding some basic light. So I'm going to focus this. So my camera is here, and I'm going to be using my camera's location as my guide to where I put in my light. So I'm looking at this from the up above, My key light is mainly going to be in the area of about 45 degrees from my key light. So over here. Now it could be right or left, and you can decide which side you want. But for now, I'm going to put the key light on the left, the fill light on the right, and then my kicker light's in the back. Does that make sense? So I'm going to be using a couple different tools. So let's go ahead and create just our standard spotlight. Create lights. Spotlight, and let's name it. So I'm going to name that key light. Okay, so just K-E-Y, or I don't even have to put light on. We know it's a light. So I'm just going to say key. All right, so we know that's our key light. And it is in my scene underneath. Oh, see what I just did? I just did exactly what I said. That's why I made that bookmark. I don't want to do that. And what I can do is, if that is something you keep doing, you can actually lock out your controls. So sometimes you want to do this. A lot of times when you're in animation, you want to lock out controls so people can't mess things up. So what I can do is I can select my camera, and my attributes over here, my translate, my rotate, I'm going to select the names of those by just click and drag. And I can right click and hold, and say lock selected. And when I do that, I get this gray bar, and now I can't I shouldn't be able to accidentally move it. So now I can't move it because it's all locked. So if I select my camera, I can see that. If I want to unlock them, I can right click, or I can shift select, right click, and say unlock select. So now they're unlocked. So it's not permanent. It's just something you can do to keep yourself from doing what I just did and having to fix your stuff all the time. Does that make sense? So locking your camera, you could do that to an object too. So you're just locking the controls or our channels for translation. Does that make sense? So now I have my camera here, or now I have my light in my scene, and I want to select that. And what I do is I will use my transform, so I'm going to hit W, and I'm going to drag that back a little bit. And I also use the T, where I get my tools control. So in my tool transform gives me this basically like an aim constraint point, where this is going to be where the camera is going to be looking. So the camera has its own transforms and the aim constraint. So I got that by hitting the T key. It's not visible if you're in just regular transform. So if you use the W key, you can't see it. You got to hit T for that to come up. Or I can click on my little icon here and I bring that up. I use this a lot because when I start working with this, it keeps it pointed at my object, and I can simply just move it to about 45 degrees where I kind of want to start, and then I can move it up and it's going to be pointing at my object. Now if I want to adjust things slightly to the right or slightly to the left, I have a pretty easy way to do that by just simply moving this around in my shot. Now I'm going to turn off my shaded wireframe here, and I can kind of see in my scene how the light is illuminating that sphere. I can see the dark shadow there, and as I move my light, and I'm doing this by saying lighting, use selected light. If I have my keyboard, if I have my keys, so 4 is wireframe, 5 is smooth shaded, and 6 will show you textures and materials, but we're not doing that right now. I'm just simply turning on my lights, and I'm saying use selected light. So without rendering anything, I can kind of see the darkness that I'm getting, and this is without adjusting anything at all on my attributes for my light. So this is my key light, and here are the different attributes that I have. So I have intensity, obviously I can bring it up, bring it down. And this is kind of where I want to start building my shot. So over here, I'm going to turn off my wireframe, and I can say use selected light. Now if I were to render that, I could see that harsh shadow right there on the side. So I have, basically you have a full moon, all these different sequences of the moon, right? As the as the light changes. So what I do is I typically work from a different, in my camera perspective, to kind of decide where am I going to put this to kind of get a little bit of key light on one side, and this is something that takes time. And as I go, this is where you can use your IPR render, and as you kind of start to well, when you use your IPR, it won't calculate your background, but you can kind of see as I'm moving this, the effect that I'm having on the lighting. And this is without really changing anything at all. I haven't added anything. I haven't increased my values at all. As I decrease sometimes our little IPR renderer doesn't want to always work the best. So this is why it can take extra time. A lot of times I'll just use my selection tool, and as I move things around, I'll start to kind of bring up now. I don't want to make things too intense or too hot, so I'm going to always just kind of be balancing. Now this doesn't have any details on it yet, but you get the basic idea. So as I start to illuminate this, you'll realize that you typically have a void on the other half, and that's what the fill light's going to be for. So I want to fill out this side. So I want to get a nice balance. I don't want it to look flat, like everything is lit the same. I want it to have form. So we want to bring the form out so you can see the beautiful details of your object. Okay? So what I usually do is I'll take that, once I have that kind of set the way that I want, and we'll adjust these as we go. I'll just say Control D and duplicate it, and I'll just drag, I'll drag the duplicate over to this side, and I'll name that Phil, like Phil Collins. No, anybody know Phil?
You're going way back. I know that.
You named the duplicate
Phil. Uh-huh. Debacle like that joke. All right, so now I have a fill light on the side. Notice now it's too flat. I don't want the object to look flat. I want it to have form. And I want to just find that delicate balance between flattening the object, making artifacts that make it look too dark, and so that's why we've got to do a lot of kind of just maneuvering with our, we have some guidelines, 45 degrees. A lot of them you'll see also, put it up there, have this shining down from your camera view and fill it out that way. And you could definitely have it coming from your camera. I typically like to move it over a little bit, soften that light, and fill it out a little. So I might jump back over here and bring this one down. And I'm going to be just kind of looking. Now I don't want it to be too gray. Now one of the things that happens is that when you have no decay on your light, as you move your light closer to your object, see how I moved it close? There isn't really much change at this distance or at this distance or at that distance. Really, the spread has changed. But when I start adding decay, it gives me, first of all, it's going to drop because it's not reaching the object quite as much. So I have to give it a little bit more power, but I can also then move that object in and get closer to my object a little bit. This works with a little bit more proximity, but I'm going to have to increase the intensity a little bit. So there's a lot of individual factors that come into play as you start to increase your lights or add things like decay. So I will find that I experiment a lot with my placement just to kind of get the thing to look the way that I want. And if you adjust your light values, and things like decay and the intensity of it, it can be you can be adjusting a lot of the or there's just a lot of variables to play with. Now, just to give it a little bit more connection to the ground, I'm going to go in and I'm going to turn on my depth map shadows, just because they're cheaper to render and it gives me that sense of placement on the ground. So I'm using a very cheap and fast type of shadow by just simply clicking the Use Depth Map Shadow here. So as I do that, I get my shadows instantaneously, which connects me to the ground. So before, it's just floating. Use Depth Map, and it is now sitting.
What's the depth map?
The depth map is on just your key light. So I've got my key light selected,
Okay.
and I'm turning on my shadows. Just my depth map shadow.
Okay.
I'm using that one because it's fast and I can get a feel for the placement of where the shadow is going to be from the light. So as I move the light around, if I raise it up, and here's where you can kind of save images. So if I move the light up and render that again, I can see that the shadow has gotten a lot closer here to my object versus where it was a second ago, where it's a little bit more out. So here it was. This is where it was. I've stretched it, and here it is a little more direct. And you may want to, for dramatic purposes, stretch your shadow. You know, as I pull my light back, I can make that shadow stretch out a little bit farther. Now I do not want it's hitting the edge of my ground plane here, so I'm going to give myself a little bit more space. So I do not want to have shadows on my fill light, because I don't want too many shadows in my scene. So I don't want my fill light to have, if I turn on my fill light shadows, then I'm going to have an X, a crisscross of shadows across my objects. I don't want that. I want to block those out. I want to just eliminate as much of that as possible, because I don't want that. Does that make sense?
Now, how are you looking at just your two lights? Are you looking at your two lights now at one time, or are you just looking at one at a time? I'm rendering
it out, and it's two lights. But in here, it's lighting as selected light. So as I click on a light, I can look at both.
Okay.
Or I could say use all lights, and then I see them both. But typically, I like to kind of know which one is doing what.
Okay.
So I'm kind of way out in space here. So I want to focus on filling out that space, giving it a nice value. And again, if I turned on quadratic, and if I would need to bump that up and move that around a little bit. So what I basically want to do is simply just fill out that back. Does that make sense? So I don't have too much going on. I'd probably get a little closer on this shot. It feels a little small, far away. The resolution on the screen, so you guys can see it in the back, is a little bit crazy. But you can kind of see I've got this side, and I've got this side not in the dark. Does that make sense? And as we get our objects in our scene, you'll want to pull out their details. So let's go ahead. I've got my fill light, I've got my key light, and I want to get some stuck in that. So what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and add my kicker lights in the back. And this is just so you can just so that you can see it. Let me go here and bring this back up. So now as we do this, what I typically do is I'll just take one of these lights, hit Control D, make a copy of it, and I'll move it to the back side. And now I'm going to change this from fill to, you can call it a kicker, you can call it backlight, but I'll say back and then right. So this is going to be my right, and it's going to be back right. And what's nice is I can just immediately go into my light attributes, and I can change the type of light it is. So right now it's a spotlight, and I'm going to use what's called the directional light. And you can see that it changed its icon, and I'm going to say use select, and you can see that it's shining now directly on the back of my object, just like the sun would be on the earth. If I were to simply render that as is, you can see that now I have this nice highlight on the back side of this sphere by simply just moving that directional light. Now wherever I move that light, if I move it more to the right, more to the left, what I'll typically do is grab a slot across here or across the top to kind of see where that light is going. If I move it over here, and you can see how it's doing a nice job of illuminating that back edge. So that's really my backlight or the kicker light. If I move it up, I'll get a little bit more up here, and I can pretty well control that by simply moving that back light and keeping it focused on my object. So here's my rim light. So what I want to do is, because I can't really get it on both sides like you can in the real world by kind of shining it on the back. Like if you put a light behind somebody and then the light is hidden from us by their body, but it creates this nice rim. Well, we can't really do that well with this. So what I do is I typically take a light like so, and I will sit it on one side or the other, and I'll basically just kind of, the closer I move it in, notice I can control where this highlight is, and I can, the more intense the light is, the more intense that glow is. So if I was to take this, there's that real intense low, or real intense light, and I can bring it down and soften that a little bit. Maybe something like that. And then when I have it where I want it, Control D, and then I'll just move that over to the other side. I'll name that back left. And this is my left, not the sphere's left. And then if I were to render that, I've got this over here. And what I want to do is just want to, like I say, I'm just trying to get a sense of that back rim. Or if I want it to be more on top, I might need to do both from the left. And this is kind of where you can play with your lights to get the look that you want. If I want it to look like it's got a nice rim across the top, I might need to look at this a little bit more as I bring this up, bring this over. I'm looking at this rim as it moves around up there. I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that? If I tried to do something like this across the back. But anyway, hopefully you can see how I'm kind of controlling that light in the back. Does that make sense? Can you see that? So those are the three main point parts, or the directions that we have the light. That's why it's called a three-point lighting. Basically, key light, fill light, and then a backlight. And unfortunately, we got to do it with two lights in this realm. Does that make sense to everybody? Now, some of the things, this is where experimentation can come in. So if I've got my object here, now once I kind of have it set and I want to adjust my shadow quality, this is when, after I have my lights in place and I'm satisfied with it, and I'm not satisfied with it yet because I haven't brought in my real object. My real object is going to have form and all that sort of stuff. But you get the idea, everybody? Now what I do is at this point, this is when I'm basically going to start working with the quality of my shadow. Because right now the shadow is a hard shadow. It's got square edges or sharp edges. Now I could go into my key light shadow attributes, and I could adjust some of the filter size. So if I adjusted the filter size a little bit, I can soften that shadow and blur it a little bit. The problem is it's blurred all the way around the shadow. It's blurred equally this edge and this edge. The more of the filter size that I use, the blurrier that edge is going to get to a point where that looks okay. So, and if that's good for you, that's okay. If you want to have a little bit of more of a realistic type of shadow, you're going to want to use a Raytrace Shadow, and you're going to need to turn that on in your software. So this is when I'm at the end and I'm really trying to produce the quality image. I would go to production quality, I would go to ray tracing, and this is where I'm going to be looking at that shadow to try to create a little bit more of a realistic view of it. So as I increase my light radius, if I increase my light radius on my key light, it'll start to blur the shadow a little bit as it dissipates from the edge of my object. So the closer my object is to the closer the shadow gets to the object, the sharper the edge gets, and then as it gets farther, you can see it start to stipple out, and that's where the shadow is going to start to soften and blur. And this typically happens more so in the real world where that edge is softening as it gets farther away. In order to reduce that amount of stippling I have here, I can increase my shadow rays, or the larger the radius of my light, the softer that edge is going to get. You can see that, how that's gotten much more soft at the edge. And then to increase that, as I increase these values, you can start to see this edge will get softer. See how it's much softer here than it is here? I don't know if you can see that, but you can actually see the little points. They get a lot smaller. When I increase those shadow rays, these points get a lot smaller versus what I had earlier where they are pretty big and blocky. So as I increase those values, the render time increases. So I was going up by 10. That render time increases, but that shadow starts to get a lot softer. And if I was to re-render that, it takes a little bit longer, but as that shadow drifts away from my object, it gets softer as that, see how sharp that edge here, and then it gets softer as it goes out. And that's going to be a combination of my shadow rays and the size of that light. The smaller the light, the sharper that edge is going to be. You can see how it kind of mostly fades out in color. When the light gets larger, that shadow begins to get broader and softer. So if I was to really push that up there, that shadow will start to spread out even more and really dissipate and get blurry in the distance. You can almost blur it out so it's a super soft fade. So typically 0.5 is about as far as I go because I like to have that edge. I do not recommend having ray traced lights on lots of lights, only the the most important object. So the key shot lights where you need the quality of the shadow, that's where you put your ray trace shadows because it'll cost a lot in time. And the other shadows in your scenes or other objects in your scenes can use depth map if they're in the background. You don't need to worry about it so much. Does that make sense? So for this rendering of your object, I definitely want to have your light using the ray tracing shadows. So you'll want to work with those values. Okay? Does that make sense? So you have the theory of like what we're doing here. What I want to do now is I want to bring in a real object and basically do the same type of thing to bring it out. And this is where you guys, do you have any questions about that so far? Everybody feel like that makes sense? So one of the things, I'm going to use my default light. I'm going to get rid of this. One of the things that you'll want to do is you'll want to actually light your object. So I'm going to import my object. So I have an object that I've saved out as a separate object. I hope I can get to it. And bring it in. So just like you, I have an object that is a a typical kitchen appliance type thing. At least in theory I have one. Maybe it won't bring it in. Let's take a break for a minute and I get this going. Looks like it didn't like my model. So I will get that going. Interesting. Quick question. All right, when we have our ground plane here, and let me turn off my.
Not on.
Oh, right. Thank you. So we have our ground plane, and we have assign new material to it, and we're using background. And when we have a light in our scene, so I'm going to create a light. Maybe directional light has been the one I think that might be giving us the trouble. And if I have it shining down on the ground, sorry, oh, this is going to be. Sorry, I had to shut mine off. Hold on a second. I'm going to turn on my reflection. I may not be able to demonstrate this. So we have like a light gray, and I have reduction quality, and we have ray tracing on. And what we're getting is, I'm going to throw an object in my scene. We're getting this back edge, right? Instead of this looking like the background, we're getting this highlight. So when we do our renders, let me show you the ground. So we're getting this. We're getting something like this with this edge, right? Everyone's seeing this hard edge. It's what that ground plane is doing on a basic level is we've got a specular color here. So the brighter the specular color, the brighter this color here, and the darker the specular color, how it's not reflecting anything. So we're just going to kind of take that out right now. We will have reflections and all of that later. So I just want to get rid of that edge. The idea is this is to be a seamless edge and not have any sort of distraction. So we're just going to control that right now by popping that out. Or we could turn down the reflectivity if we wanted to, and that also will kind of control it. But for now, let's just turn down that color and leave it like that. So it'll look kind of flat without the distraction of that, but we'll work with that later. But I just don't want that edge back there. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So it's fairly easy to clean that up. All right. That is all I got today. We've got, when we come in, we're going to be rendering out our scene. So when we render these out and we save our scene, we're going to save as a JPEG this time. So we're using different ones. We've used PNGs. We can use PNGs for other things that require transparencies for our backgrounds. Right now we aren't going to be dealing with that, so we can render out just a JPEG, just a plain JPEG image. It will calculate the background and it will look like a solid color. And it will actually be a solid color instead of a fake transparent color that is actually not there. So we want that to be a JPEG. So when you end up rendering, choose JPEG for this particular render. There'll be other applications for other things, but for now, just simple JPEG. Does that make sense? When we critique on Wednesday, we're going to do what's called a silent critique, where you're going to bring your model up on your desktop. You're going to have your model open, your render of your model open, and your reference images available so that we can look at that and look at your model, look around your scene, and then see your rendered image. So it's basically going to be like looking at a photograph of your model, the model, and then your reference images, so we can see kind of what you were looking at and what your parts are supposed to look like. Does that make sense? So inside your project folder, you'll have all those things. You'll have your scene file, your reference images, and your rendered image. All right? And that's what we'll be doing. So bring that with you. So not only upload it to Cobra, like when you turn it in, but bring that so you can open it up at your seat. And I don't have to do anything. You just bring it up, set it up, and then we'll just go around seat by seat and just spend 5 minutes at a station. We're going to write down our comments on your model and then move on. So it's called a silent critique. Okay? So that's what class will be like on Wednesday, and it'll take most of the time. And I'll see you then.
So the assignment that's due tomorrow is
So what was due tomorrow? Oh, this is just the
basically
cinematic.
what we're doing.
What we did here, I'll give you credit for doing it because you're all doing it.
Okay.
You don't have to do it because critique is Wednesday, and
Okay,
you'll
that's
have
right.
it done on your project.
Okay.
Yeah, good question.
So the homework will not be due. You will just.
Right,
what we're
yeah,
doing
yeah.
and
It's
then-
like credit for
Okay.
just being in class and doing it today.
Okay.
The cinematic lighting, you'll get points for it today. You don't have to turn it in. Does that make sense? And then we'll critique on Wednesday.
Did you want us to try to bring in the objects we're making on Wednesday?
Yeah, if you have your object and you can bring it in, bring it in. I think that'll be great because we can take pictures. I'm gonna have Megan come in and take pictures of your actual objects if you got them. Does that make sense? Bring them in, yeah. Anytime you're working on stuff like that, bring it in. It's great to see it. It helps understand what we're actually trying to do.
I would, except it's sold Saturday.
Ah. All right.
I told you as soon as I make something, somebody finds out it's bought.
Yeah, that's great. Well, have a good day, everybody.